I made a mistake and cheated on my husband, but now he's ghosted me without a word. I made a terrible mistake, and I'm afraid I'll have to live with the consequences for the rest of my life. You can call me Cindy. I'm 23 years old, and my boyfriend is Cameron, who is 25. We both come from a small town in Oklahoma. He was a couple of years older than me, but we'd never really connected on a personal level. Our chance to get to know each other better came just over 3 years ago at the grocery store where I worked as a cashier. Cameron would often come into the store on weekends or during breaks from college to grab I made meals and a kombucha tea for lunch. I typically worked the express checkout, and if he happened to be there when I was on duty, he'd opt for my register. He always conducted himself with politeness and kindness, and I found him incredibly endearing. The sound of his voice had a way of melting my heart and sending shivers down my spine. I tried to drop numerous subtle hints to express my interest, but he didn't seem to pick up on them. Then one day, when he was checking out and my line was moving slowly, I decided to strike up a conversation by asking him about his major. I continued asking questions as a way to demonstrate my interest. After roughly 10 minutes, he finally caught on. Just as a couple of shoppers with baskets started heading towards my register, Cameron remarked, "Looks like you're getting busy here." He jotted down his number on the receipt I handed him and departed, suggesting that I should call him whenever I had some free time. This occurred on a Saturday, and my work shift ended at 3:30. Monday morning. As soon as I finished work, I called him and we chatted for a couple of hours. He invited me to dinner that night and I said yes. We got really close during our second date, which was just before he went back to school. It might sound crazy, but I fell in love with him that weekend. We kept seeing each other every weekend, either Cameron driving home or me going to his college to spend time together. Everything was going really well until he got a good job in the city. The city bought a new Wrangler and got him an apartment close to his workplace. A few months later, he asked me to move in with him, and I was happy to say yes, even though my parents weren't totally on board with us living together before marriage. They supported our relationship because they liked both of us. He told me and our parents that this was a trial run to see if we were compatible for marriage. I was really happy that our relationship was going well and that we were enjoying our lives in the busy city. After growing up in a small rural town, there were lots of activities to take part in and we met lots of interesting people and felt like we fit in. I got a job at a local coffee shop just a few blocks from our apartment, and I loved it. The owners were really friendly, and our customers were great too. I met lots of lovely people and still keep in touch with most of my regular customers on social media. Cameron and I had been living together for nearly 9 months, and he'd been in the apartment for over 10. So we started looking at other places in the area, even though we loved our current place. We were just looking to see what else was out there. We looked at more than a dozen apartments, and it was interesting to see the different designs and layouts. If we decide to move, Cameron would need to give our landlord written notice 30 days before his lease expired to avoid it automatically renewing a month later. I joined a local yoga class near our apartment, but in the opposite direction from my coffee shop. One of the regulars at the yoga studio also went to our coffee shop, so let's call him Ed for privacy reasons. Ed was an attractive older gentleman with he had a well-built physique, and I figured he was in his late 40s or so, around the same age as my parents. Ed was always super friendly to everyone at the coffee shop, chatting with everyone, not just me. He'd spend a couple of hours a day working on his laptop at our shop. He'd mentioned that he was an entrepreneur, and I figured he must be doing well since he drove a new Bronco and dressed in stylish clothes with matching shoes and jewelry. One day, I struck up a conversation with Ed and asked about yoga because I was intrigued by his evident passion for it. I asked if he would recommend the yoga studio he went to. He said he liked yoga and thought I would too. I decided to check out the studio myself. It was conveniently located within walking distance of our apartment. Cameron was a member of a large gym located just across the street. It was more than 20 minutes away from his office, and with traffic it could take 35 minutes or more. I didn't want to drive my old Saturn such a long distance. I started going to yoga classes and quickly got into it. I would usually go to the studio right after my work shift ended at 2 p.m. My schedule worked out perfectly. I started work at 6 a.m. and finished at 2 p.m. I then went to the yoga studio until 3:30 p.m. and then went home to prepare dinner for Cameron during one of my shifts at the coffee shop. Ed asked me about my experience at the studio. I told him I was really enthusiastic about it and thanked him for the recommendation. He asked me what time I went, and I told him that I went right after work at 2 o'clock. Ed said he might start going to classes around that time too. He was planning to do hot yoga a few days a week, with classes starting at 1:30 p.m. He also told me that he spends 3 to 5 days a week at a local gym doing weightlifting and boxing. A couple of days later, I saw Ed at the yoga studio. We had a chat just like we did at the coffee shop. He convinced me to try a hot yoga class. I gave it a shot and loved it. As time passed, we started spending more time together at the studio. We ended up spending more and more time together at the studio, taking classes together. In hindsight, I can see how inappropriate this was, but at the time, I didn't think about it. This continued for several weeks until one day, for reasons I can't explain, Ed and I found ourselves back at Cameron's apartment on a Thursday afternoon. We did something truly regrettable, a mistake. I really regret what I did. I felt really guilty about it, but I agreed to meet Ed again on Monday at his place. I didn't want to show disrespect to Cameron by bringing Ed back to his home. Ed's apartment was in a rather sketchy neighborhood. It was quite sparsely furnished, with only a couple of old chairs. The apartment had a TV, a small dining table with 2 chairs, a modest double bed, and an aged dresser. It wasn't what I had expected, and I considered leaving. In hindsight, I wish I had, but I didn't want to come across as impolite. It became evident that Ed wasn't as prosperous as I had assumed. He had invested most of his money in his car, clothing, and other personal items. I also noticed that Ed had a lot of jewelry, but not much in the way of furniture. After that encounter, I told Ed that we needed to end our relationship because I loved my boyfriend and didn't want to risk losing him. Ed looked at me in a cynical way and laughed, suggesting that I couldn't possibly love my boyfriend if I'd just done what I'd done. I replied that I loved him more than anything, and Ed retorted, "Well, you may love him, but your desire for me outweighs your feelings for him by far." It was a harsh reality check for me, and I insisted, "No, that's not true." I gathered my belongings and left Ed's apartment as I exited. I felt tainted and incredibly foolish for my actions. This wasn't characteristic of me. I promise it's not. I don't know what happened with Ed, but it just did. It's not an excuse, but I'm trying to understand my actions. I spent the rest of the afternoon in tears until Cameron got home. We had dinner, watched TV, and relaxed on the couch, but I noticed that Cameron seemed distant. He'd been feeling unwell for several days, so I assumed it was because of that. On Tuesday he showed up, but still kept his distance, mentioning that he didn't feel quite right. It had been nearly a week since we'd been intimate, and I started to worry about his health because we usually didn't abstain. Looking back, I suspect he might have known about Ed and me and was keeping his distance. On Wednesday, I got home just before 3 p.m. Monday. I went to get my apartment key, but it wasn't on my key ring. I started to worry that it had fallen off. The key itself wasn't broken and all my other keys were still there, but the apartment key was missing. I thought about the possibility that it had broken off, but I couldn't figure out how. Then I thought, could someone have taken it off my key ring to get into our apartment? I figured out that Cameron had taken it. I tried calling him a few times and sending him texts, but he didn't respond. This was strange because he usually would text me saying he was busy. I went to the apartment office and asked them to let me in because they had keys to all the apartments in our building. I explained the situation to one of the coordinators. The coordinators went into the manager's office and closed the door. A few minutes later, they called me back into the office and asked me to take a seat. The manager explained that Cameron had moved out that morning and provided a letter to terminate the lease at the end of its one term. I was shocked and couldn't say anything. Before I could even think, the manager told me that Cameron had left a few bags of his stuff for me in the next office over, which they'd locked. They took me to the office, and there were 3 big laundry bags with all my stuff in them, including all the gifts I'd bought for Cameron over the years. It suddenly hit me that they knew about Ed and me, and I just broke down in front of these ladies. They were really nice and helped me carry the bags to my car. They even told me to sit down for a few minutes because they were worried about my emotional state and safety on the road. The manager asked if there was someone they could contact on my behalf, but I said no, that I would be okay. I told them I was going to sit in my car and get myself together before leaving. I also asked if Cameron had given them an address to send things to, but they said they couldn't tell me because of privacy rules. They were really helpful, giving me water, granola bars, and tissues. They made sure I didn't do anything I'd regret. I was in a bad way, so I stayed in my car for over an hour, crying and thinking about what to do next. I tried to call and text Cameron lots of times, but he didn't reply. I asked if I could stay in the apartment until the end of the lease, since he was paying for it. I thought this might help. I thought the question would prompt a response, but it didn't. I knew he was furious, but interestingly, he hadn't blocked my calls or messages, which gave me a glimmer of hope. I briefly considered going to his office to confront him, but ultimately decided against it because I didn't want to create a scene in his workplace and jeopardize his job or professional reputation. I decided against that because he was well liked at the company and had a bright future ahead of him. Instead, I spent about an hour driving around town, thinking about what to do next. I finally decided to check into a new Homestyle Suites hotel near our apartment. They were having a grand opening, with rates at $179 per night or $1. I needed to find a place to stay, even though I knew I couldn't afford an extended stay. Once I settled into the hotel room, I spent the entire night in tears, wondering how Cameron had discovered the truth. I could only come up with two possibilities. Ed had informed him directly or through someone else, or Cameron might have had surveillance cameras in our apartment. I hoped fervently that it was the former. As I dreaded the idea of Cameron witnessing me with another man. I felt utterly ashamed, like a terrible person who had inflicted pain on the person I loved most and who had treated me so well. The following day, I received a call from my mother. She was incredibly furious, more enraged than I had ever heard her. She demanded, "What on earth did you do?" I feigned ignorance, but she revealed that she had just spoken with Cameron's mother. My mom told her that Cameron said we had broken up because I had been intimate with an older man. I told my mom the truth and said I was sorry. She started yelling and screaming and crying during our call, which lasted over 45 minutes. Then she hung up on me. My dad called and said he was disappointed in me, which upset me a lot. I asked if I could move back home, and he agreed, but only if I got professional help, maybe a therapist. I accepted, apologized again, and asked if he still loved me. He said he did, but he was really disappointed. I handed in my resignation at the coffee shop and went home 11 days later. I kept trying to reach out to Cameron, but he never replied. I did some research online. I came across advice suggesting it's best to give a betrayed partner some space, which I tried to do even though it was tearing me apart inside. When I got back home, it seemed like everyone in town knew about our breakup and why it happened. Felt like an absolute nightmare. Is there any way I can reconcile with Cameron? I'm not sure how he found out the truth or what he might have seen, but given his personality, I'm afraid he may never be willing to forgive me. I'm willing to communicate with him again. I love him deeply, and I know I have to do everything I can to win him back, regardless of what happens. I'll live with the regret for the rest of my life. Thank you, and I kindly request that your comments be compassionate. Update. I'm back home now, living with my mom and dad. I've taken a job as a cashier at a newly opened dollar store in town. It seems like everyone in this town people are still talking about me, and I can't help but feel embarrassed. It seems like everyone in town knows that Ed was the person I cheated with. I did some online research and was shocked to discover that Ed is actually 62 years old. I had no idea about his age and had previously thought he was in his late 40s. What's even worse is that he has a criminal record dating back 17 years with 2 newspaper articles about his past arrests and trials still accessible. I could have easily found all this information with a simple online search, but I was too preoccupied to do so. It's still hard to believe I acted the way I did during that time. Not only did I betray the man I love, but I did so with someone who's far from admirable. I hope the town's gossip will eventually die down in a few months, as I don't think I can bear living here much longer. It's taking a heavy toll on my mental well-being. Sometimes I think I'll just lock myself in my room and not face the world. My parents are really embarrassed by what I did. They've made it clear that if I do something like this again, they'll disown me. They think I've brought shame to the family, which has only made me feel worse about myself. I've been struggling with severe depression as a result of this whole situation. Cameron hasn't reached out to me. We haven't spoken since the night before he locked me out of the apartment. I just wish he would pick up the phone and express his anger or any emotion at all. I just want to apologize to him in person. I think it would help me move on. I've been in therapy for a couple of weeks, and it's been helpful. My therapist is compassionate but also quite straightforward. Following her advice, I've refrained from trying to contact Cameron. I've started focusing on myself instead. She also said that I've already apologized to Cameron through text and voicemail, and he knows about it. But it seems like he doesn't want anything to do with me right now. Over the past week, I've been focusing on my job, eating right, getting enough rest, and going on long walks. I do feel better, but I still miss my partner. I'm taking each day as it comes, hoping for a reconciliation with Cameron, but also preparing for the possibility that it may not happen. I don't intend to date anyone anytime soon. Even though I've been getting requests from 4 customers at the store, my heart and mind are I'm still under Cameron's influence, so I don't anticipate providing any further updates unless we manage to reunite. Thanks and best wishes to all of you. That was a fun story. Now let's move on to another exciting one. Stay tuned and let's dive in. I'm almost done with my divorce after being married for 23 years. After 23 years of marriage, my wife Connie and I decided to call it quits. We got married when I was 23 and she was 21. We met at college during my 3rd year and got together pretty quickly. We always knew we'd get married. And we did, right after she finished college. I found a job at a company near where I grew up. My parents ran a working farm there with 8 full-time and 4 seasonal workers. I grew up on a farm with my brother Bill. He's 3 years younger than me and didn't go to college. Instead, he worked as a laborer on the farm over the years. My dad tried giving Bill different management roles, but he preferred being a farm laborer doing his job and getting paid. He continued doing that until he passed away from cancer earlier this year. The farm has nearly 700 acres and 3 houses. My parents live in the main house, which is set back from the main road and also houses the farm office. My brother lived in the carriage house is where the driveway meets the main road. My wife, kids, and I live in a farmhouse that's 3/4 of a mile down the main road from my parents and brother. My parents purchased the neighboring property through the business to expand the farm and preserve the farmhouse. All 3 homes belong to the Family Farm Corporation. My brother and I lived in our homes without paying rent. My parents are the only officers in the company, but they arranged it so that we could live there without paying rent. My brother and I would inherit the farm when they passed away, with Bill getting 45% and me getting 55%. I was given the majority control because I helped them manage the farm alongside my regular job. I didn't receive payment for this work, but we lived without paying rent on the property. Of course, I would eventually inherit the majority ownership. It was a great family setup and we all loved it here. My oldest child is 21. We have a 21-year-old girl, a 20-year-old boy, a 17-year-old boy, and our youngest is 15. Life was great for us all. I was happy and loved my wife, Connie. Our kids were great. My job was going well and the farm was doing well too. I've given you enough background to understand the situation. So, let me address the main issue, which is why I'm writing to you. About 3 years ago, my brother was diagnosed with cancer. He didn't take care of himself and didn't seek treatment until his symptoms became unbearable. By the time they found the cancer, it had already spread to other parts of his body. He went through a rough patch with chemotherapy and radiation treatments. It really took a toll on him, but he kept at it. Unfortunately, Bill passed away earlier this year, and it was a very emotional time for all of us, especially me. Bill looked up to me as his role model, and I helped him with several problems he faced throughout his life. Bill's routine was mainly going to work and then spending the rest of his time at bars and social clubs in town. He had a drinking problem that I helped him overcome 4 years before he passed away. He also had some serious tax issues which I helped him sort out. He needed help with the basics of life and I was there for him. We were close and my wife and kids also cared for him. They saw him as the eccentric Uncle Bill, but he wasn't unintelligent or lazy. He just lacked ambition. Over the years, Bill had several girlfriends, but none of those relationships lasted. Most of them were women he met at bars. He did date a nice girl once, and I thought it might lead to something more, but she eventually left him because of my parents accepted Bill for who he was and didn't pressure him. They loved him unconditionally, just as they loved me. In his will, Bill named me as the executive of his estate and specified that I should receive 100% of all his assets. This included a life insurance policy, a small checking account, and his personal belongings, such as his motorcycle and truck. About 2 weeks after his funeral, I was at Bill's place, paying bills and going through the piles of paperwork he had on his kitchen table. I found a statement from an out-of-town bank. There, the account had over $70. I was really surprised by the amount, but what surprised me even more were the names on the statement. The account was in Bill's name and my youngest son, who I'll call Joe, was listed as the payable on death beneficiary. This confused me. I wonder why my brother set up the account like this and why he chose only Joe as the beneficiary. Bill wasn't any closer to Joe than my other kids. In fact, I was closer to the rest of my kids than Joe, so I was puzzled but couldn't figure it out. I thought about calling my wife and parents to tell them, but I decided not to do it just yet. The next day, I went to the bank since I was the executive. I could find out that Bill opened the money market account a month after Joe was born and regularly added money to it every 2 weeks. At this point, I started thinking there must be some connection between Bill and Joe. I even wondered if Bill and Connie had an affair. Was Joe actually Bill's son? I was really anxious that night. I went back to Bill's house and went through his files, trying to find something that could give me a clue. I spent hours searching through everything in the house. Then I found something that changed my life forever. It was 2 old photos of my wife. In one, she had no shirt on. In the other, she was holding a beer and wearing nothing at all. Both photos were taken in Bill's bedroom. My whole world fell apart. I stayed at Bill's house for several more hours that night, going back and forth between crying and feeling angry. Eventually, Connie called and asked what I was doing, so I went home. I didn't confront her right then because I needed time to think about what I wanted to do. One photo showed her in a shirt, and the other showed her holding a beer and wearing nothing at all. Both photos were taken in Bill's bedroom. I was in shock. I stayed at Bill's house for several more hours that night, going back and forth between crying and feeling angry. Eventually, Connie called and asked what I was doing, so I went home. I didn't confront her right then because I needed time to think about what I wanted to do. I thought about just ignoring what I'd found. After all, the pictures were from years ago, and my brother was no longer alive. But I quickly realized I could never live with myself if I ignored it. So I told my parents what I'd discovered. I took the afternoon off and met with them at the farm office. I showed them the bank account and then the pictures. My parents couldn't believe it when they saw the pictures of my wife. They were both upset and disgusted by what I had found. They understood the situation just as well as I did. They asked me what I was planning to do. I told them I intended to talk to Connie. If it turned out to be true, I would file for a divorce. They understood, but my mom advised me to think carefully before taking any action. I took Connie with me to Bill's house. She thought we were going there to help clean and organize things. When we entered the house, I sat her down and said, "We need to talk." Then I got a packet containing the bank statement and pictures of her. I gave her the bank statement first. She looked at it and just said, "Wow." She couldn't believe that Bill had saved so much money. I asked her if she noticed anything unusual on the I asked her to read the whole statement aloud, starting from the top. She read the bank's name and address, then Bill's name, followed by payable on death to Joe, our last name. When she read this, she looked up at me with a shocked expression. I think she realized right then that she was caught. She said, "I wonder why Bill did this." I asked her if there was something I asked her again if she was sure, and she said yes. I handed her the photos, and she immediately froze with tears in her eyes. She said, "Let me explain. and I encouraged her to do so. She excused herself to the bathroom, and I heard her throwing up. She came out 15 minutes later and admitted to the affair she had with Bill 18 years ago. She said it was stupid and selfish of her to claim it only lasted for a couple of weeks. Connie said she realized her mistake quickly and ended it. She said that since then, she had distanced herself from Bill and only interacted with him when other family members were around. I then asked her if Joe was Bill's son. She said no, he was definitely mine. I asked her how she was so sure. She said she just knew he was, even if he wasn't. I told her not to go there because this was about her relationship with Bill, not my relationship with Joe. She cried more and begged for my forgiveness, but I didn't show her any sympathy or comfort. Instead, I got up to leave and told her not to come home until she had settled down and cleaned herself up because I didn't want our kids to see her like that. I went home, and she came back about an hour later and kept asking me to talk, but I told her we'd have time for that later. We slept in the same bed that night, but I turned away from her and she cried silently for most of the night without sleeping. The next day, I took a day off from work and went to the main house to talk to Mom and Dad. I told them about Connie's confession, and they couldn't believe it. I also told my mom that I intended to divorce Connie. My mom asked if that's what I truly wanted, and I said that I didn't want to stay married to her, given what she had done. After meeting with my parents, I returned home and told Connie about my decision to file for divorce. She completely broke down and begged me, saying that this all happened a long time ago. I told her again that Joe wasn't the issue and that my love for him wouldn't change no matter who his biological father was. I explained that this was about her and me. She had betrayed me in a significant way. I emphasized that it didn't matter if it happened 18 years ago or even in the 1800s. I met with a lawyer we use for the farm. He recommended a divorce attorney. He was a friend of his, and I had an appointment with him later that day to start the divorce process. Since the farm and the 3 houses were part of the corporation, they weren't at risk in the divorce settlement. However, the attorney explained that our other assets would likely be divided evenly, even with the infidelity involved. He also mentioned that because my wife had never worked outside the home, he said I'd have to pay spousal support for at least 5 years, maybe more. He said we'd fight this in court, but based on his experience with similar cases, that was the expected outcome. I was prepared for this, and money wasn't my primary concern. I just wanted to end the marriage. When I got home, I told Connie about the attorney's advice, and she became very upset. She cried and begged for a second chance, but I kept telling her no. Then I informed her that I would be talking to the kids that weekend. I mentioned that I would first talk to Joe, and then I'd meet with the rest of the kids together with Joe to tell them. She asked if she could be part of the meeting, but I told her no. She could meet with them after I had talked to them on Saturday morning. When Saturday morning came, I spoke to Joe about something important. We went to the creek on the farm where we have a pavilion and picnic benches. It was there that I told him the news, and he was understandably upset and worried. He asked if I'd still love him if he wasn't my biological son. I reassured him that I absolutely would. I told him not to worry about that because whether he and his siblings were biologically mine or not, my love for them would stay the same. I told him that I loved him and that nothing would change. I explained that the issue was between his mother and me and that he and his siblings were not at fault. I also made it clear that I would be divorcing her, emphasizing that it was entirely due to the affair with Uncle Bill and had nothing to do with him. We sat there talking. I spent the next couple of hours telling him that the next step was to meet with his siblings whenever he felt ready. He asked for some time to prepare, so I told him to take as much as he needed. We went back to the house and acted like everything was normal, but my wife was acting differently. My kids noticed right away that my wife was acting differently. We spent most of the afternoon by the pool playing games like cornhole and tossing the frisbee. It seemed like a typical summer weekend for us, except for the dark secret that was about to be revealed. After dinner, Joe approached me and said he was ready to talk to his brothers and sisters. However, they all had plans that evening with their friends, so we decided to have the conversation the following morning. We all got up the next day, had breakfast, and went to Sunday church services as we usually did. After church, I told the kids that I needed to talk to them privately on the back patio. My daughter asked if Mom would be joining us, and I said not right now, but she would meet with them later. This made the kids uneasy. I shared the news with them, and it was difficult to see the shock on their faces. They reacted as you might expect. Disbelief followed by anger and then sadness. I explained that I would be divorcing their mom, and they all started to cry. We had a long conversation, and eventually they understood my decision. My daughter expressed her anger and said she didn't want anything to do with her mother. I advised each of them. I told them they're young adults and should process this in their own way. I also encouraged them not to judge their mother based on this situation alone, but to consider their entire relationship, which had been very good. They agreed, but they were still angry and none of them wanted to meet with her right away. I mentioned that I wanted to get DNA tests for each of them. I told them that their mom said she was with Uncle Bill for only a short time, but I wanted the DNA tests for my own peace of mind and to know the truth. I assured them that if the test showed that any of them weren't biologically, it wouldn't change anything because they were legally my children, and I would still love them the same way even if they turned out not to be my biological kids. Later that evening, their mom met with them in the dining room, and it was a very emotional conversation. I was outside during that time but could hear parts of their discussion. The kids told their mother that they loved her, but they would never see her in the same way and probably wouldn't forgive her for what she did to me and our family. This was incredibly hard for her to hear, but she deserved it. After the divorce was finalized, my wife slept in the guest room. The divorce process took nearly 8 months. During this time, my wife tried to convince me daily to stay together and seek marriage counseling, but I didn't change my mind. 3 months after I found out about the affair, my parents received a significant offer from a developer to buy the house my family lived in along with the surrounding 80 acres for a considerable amount of money. My parents and I decided to accept the offer as a business decision, so my wife, our 2 youngest kids, and I moved out 60 days later. My wife moved into a 3-bedroom house. My wife moved into a bedroom apartment in town, and it was then that she really started to struggle. She became very depressed and needed to take multiple medications to cope. I moved back in with my parents for a while, and during this time I decided to build my dream house on the backside of the farm, which I had wanted to do for a while. It seemed like the right opportunity, so I worked with an architect to design the house, which turned out to be a mid-sized log cabin with 3 bedrooms. The house is now finished, and I live there with my 2 youngest kids. They also spend a few nights a week with their mom, my ex. My wife is still struggling with depression, but she's gradually getting better. She wants to reconcile and get back together, but I'm not interested. I treat her with respect, like someone I have an obligation to, but I don't have any romantic feelings for her. It's strange how discovering the affair turned off my love for her. We still communicate daily, but I try to limit our conversations to matters concerning our kids. She doesn't have anyone here besides our family, so I can't completely cut her off. I feel a sense of obligation towards her when it came to the DNA tests. As it turned out, all of my kids are biologically mine. All the stress, drama, and sleepless nights were unnecessary, but I needed to find out. However, this didn't change my feelings toward Connie. She betrayed me in the worst possible way, and I'll never forget or fully forgive her. I still can't figure it out. I'd like to know why Bill named Joe as the beneficiary on that account. My ex and sister never talked about paternity, and I believe she in this regard. Perhaps Bill simply assumed or maybe even wished that Joe was his in general. I'm happy with where I am now and the relationships I have with my kids and my ex. My wife, even though I'll never trust her again, I do care about her and want her to have a happy life. I'm not sure why I decided to share this, but putting it into words has made me feel better and has made me even more grateful for how things turned out. Thanks for reading my story, and I wish you all the best of luck.